Whoopi Goldberg, the immortal legend of American stage and screen, one of the very few artists in history to wear the prestigious EGOT crown, conquering all four of the most coveted awards, Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony, the irreplaceable moderator of The View, the eternal soul of the Color Purple Ghost and Sister Act. Her name shines in Hollywood's eternal Hall of Fame, engraved with both laughter and depth, proving that a single voice can reshape culture. From the crumbling walls of a New York housing project, from hunger, contempt, and ridicule, she rose to build not only a career but also a colossal, hard-earned fortune and a vast empire of influence. She left behind a legacy far beyond any measure of gold. She redefined the presence of black talent on screen, shattered the glass ceilings of gender and race, and became living proof that greatness can rise despite all circumstances. For decades, she has been more than an artist. She has been the story of survival, triumph, and the rewriting of the American dream with her own blood and tears. But behind that radiant glory lies a battlefield scarred with wounds. The suffocating loneliness of 3 broken marriages, the shadows of painful downfalls, the despair that drowned her, the controversies that engulfed her, and the life and death battles with devastating illnesses. She became one of the few artists who were both honored as an icon and suffocated by harsh public judgment over her words. And if the storms of the past nearly destroyed her, then the trials at the age of 70 remained dark and relentless, like a shadow refusing to let go. What still hides behind the smile that once conquered America? What still echoes in the final chapters of a journey both glorious and tragic? We will seek the answer together. Whether you admire or doubt her, if she ever left a mark on your memory, leave a like as a tribute to a life both radiant and storm-filled. There are streets where children play with laughter, and there are streets where laughter is drowned by hunger and a cruel, heartbreaking silence. On November 13, 1955, inside the decaying Chelsea Elliott housing projects of Manhattan, Corinne Elaine Johnson, later known to the world as Whoopi Goldberg, came into a world already broken. Her father, Robert James Johnson Jr., a Baptist clergyman, had already chosen absence before her memories could form, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of a man she would never truly know. Her mother, Emma, worked as both a nurse and a teacher, pushing herself until her body nearly collapsed, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. With no partner to lean on, she raised Whoopi and her brother Clyde within walls where peeling paint and flickering hallway lights whispered of poverty, where the smell of damp concrete mixed with the echoes of arguments bleeding through paper-thin walls, and where every meal felt like a battlefield. My mother never gave up, Whoopi would later recall. She carried us through everything. Those early years were not filled with bedtime stories, but with the sight of Emma slumping into a chair after double shifts, with unpaid bills piled like monuments of despair on the kitchen table, and with children forced to grow up faster than their years. Sometimes dinner was nothing more than stale breadcrumbs or watered-down milk. Clothes wore thin, shoes outlived their soles, and the absence of a father pressed down on the little girl like a stone she could never shake. By the late 1960s, as Whoopi entered her teenage years, school should have been a refuge. Instead, it became another battlefield. In classrooms hazy with chalk dust and tests marked with angry red strokes, teachers branded her slow and stupid. She wasn't lazy, she wasn't unintelligent, she was dyslexic, a condition no one recognized. For years I thought I was dumb. Nobody knew it was dyslexia, she admitted later. Every failed test was not just a grade. It was a wound carved into her spirit. Every laugh from classmates rang louder than her own thoughts. By 1971, at just 16, overwhelmed and defeated, she walked away from school. The shame of that decision haunted her for years, though later she would understand it was not weakness but a misunderstood learning struggle. Yet the most devastating wound struck even earlier. In 1969, at only 14, still a child herself, Whoopi faced the terrifying reality of an unplanned teenage pregnancy. Alone, with no guidance and no safe place to turn, she clung to the desperate whispers of other frightened girls, resorting to remedies so unsafe they nearly destroyed her. I drank strange concoctions and it nearly destroyed me, she later confessed in the book The Choices We Made. The reckless attempt left her gravely ill, scarred by a trauma no child should ever endure. A year later, in 1970, at 15, she faced the same ordeal again, but this time the law in New York had just changed, and for the first time she was able to receive safe, legal medical care, a change that quite literally saved her life. It was a turning point, but one that left deep shadows etched into her memory. Out of that pain grew a fire, a lifelong commitment to speak up for women's rights, determined that no young girl should ever again be left so desperate and alone. These were not simply childhood struggles, they were battles that could have broken her completely. A father who walked away, a mother stretched to her breaking point, poverty pressing in from every corner, a mind branded as worthless, a child forced to carry adult burdens before she had finished being a child. And yet within those bleak housing projects, the seed of resilience was sown. I didn't think I was smart, Whoopi later admitted, but I knew I could survive. And survive she did. Through hunger, humiliation, and heartbreak, she carried forward not just scars but a strength forged in fire, a strength that would one day lift her from the silence that crushed her to a voice that shook the world. But survival came with a cruel price. The girl who had already carried the wounds of poverty, shame, and silence stepped into adulthood with nothing but scars, and the world outside was no kinder. After walking away from school at 16 in 1971, Whoopi carried no diploma, no safety net, and no roadmap. What she carried instead was a deep, knowing sense of being broken. In that void, she searched for escape. And the escape she found was chemical. In the haze of the 1970s, she slipped into a tragic spiral, experimenting with substances that promised light but delivered only darkness. LSD, heroin, anything that could silence the echo of her own despair. For a brief moment, the euphoria felt like freedom, but the collapse that followed was brutal, merciless. "Sometimes you think you found a friend," she admitted years later, "but it isn't your friend." Each attempt to quit was like clawing up a cliff only to slide back into the abyss. The cycle of false highs and crushing lows deepened her shame, and there were moments when the abyss seemed final. But the stubborn seed of survival refused to die. Slowly, painfully, she clawed her way out, one battle at a time. It was not one victory, but many, countless stumbles, countless restarts until she finally broke the chain. Her recovery was not graceful, but it was fierce, and it was hers. That battle left her with scars, but also with an unshakable lesson she would carry forever. Escape cannot heal you. Only courage can. Her life became a restless odyssey, drifting westward in search of both survival and meaning. She landed first in San Diego, then in Berkeley, California. Piecing together a fragile existence through an endless string of jobs, she was a waitress balancing trays in diners where the tips barely covered bus fare. She was a bricklayer with hands blistered raw from stones heavier than her dreams. She worked in a funeral home applying makeup to the lifeless faces of the departed, an eerie reminder that death hovered near even as she clung to life. She taught acting and comedy in dimly lit workshops, holding on to performance as a lifeline, as if laughter could keep her from sinking. Among her students was a young Courtney Love, who would one day become a star in her own right. For Whoopi, teaching was never about prestige. It was about survival, about clawing back a fragment of dignity in a world that offered her none. And then came 1978, the year another scar carved itself into her soul. On an ordinary day in San Diego, she looked up and saw the unthinkable. Two planes colliding in the sky. Metal tore through clouds, fire bloomed against the blue, and fragments rained down like falling stars that carried only horror. That single moment seared itself into her mind, and for the next 13 years the sky became her prison. The mere thought of boarding a plane triggered waves of panic, her palms slick with sweat, her breath caught in her chest, her heart racing as if it might tear free. "I couldn't do it," she admitted later, describing the invisible chains that locked her to the ground. While others soared above, Whoopi traveled by bus, mile after mile, city after city, staring out the window as America blurred past, chasing a fragile dream while carrying the unbearable weight of the sky she no longer trusted. Her tour bus became both sanctuary and cage, keeping her moving forward while keeping her bound to the earth. But the world does not wait forever, and as her talent began to attract attention, opportunities came that no bus could carry her to. One contract was placed before her, life-changing, undeniable. To seize it, she had to face the one fear that ruled her life. The night before the flight, her nerves betrayed her. Sweat poured down her face, her body screamed for escape. Her heart pounded like a drum of doom, and yet she boarded. She sat rigid in her seat, eyes clenched shut. Every bump in the air a private battle against terror. It was not grace, it was not triumph, it was raw survival. Trembling, imperfect, but survival nonetheless. That flight marked not just her journey across the country, but her first victory against the shadows that had haunted her since that day in the San Diego sky. These years of wandering, stumbling, and silently suffering were not wasted. They were the crucible in which Whoopi Goldberg's resilience was forged. Addiction had nearly destroyed her, but her recovery proved the indestructible power of persistence. Endless jobs stripped her bare, but they revealed her endurance. The fire in the sky chained her to the ground, but breaking that chain proved she could conquer even the fears that ruled her. She was no longer just surviving. She was learning to fight. And in the smoky rooms of Berkeley's experimental theater, she began to turn wounds into words, scars into characters, and pain into performance. Out of the ashes of her darkest years, the voice of Whoopi Goldberg began to rise. The same voice that would one day echo across the world. There are moments when a broken life finds its stage, when pain itself transforms into performance, and for Whoopi Goldberg, that moment came in 1982. After years of wandering, clawing back dignity in dim workshops and smoky basements, she finally stepped into the light with her first on-screen appearance in Citizen. I'm Not Losing My Mind, I'm Giving It Away. It was a small film, barely a whisper in Hollywood, but behind that role was a voice born of scars, one that would soon shake the world. That whisper became a roar just a year later. In 1983, she unleashed her one-woman show, raw, searing, funny, and heartbreaking all at once. In a torrent of monologues, she slipped between characters with soul, satire, and staggering humanity. Audiences laughed, cried, and rose to their feet, stunned by a performer who carried every wound of her past in every word. Broadway came calling, and Whoopi answered, performing 156 sold-out shows that turned a downtown outsider into New York's newest star. But Broadway glory was never free. Success meant grueling schedules, the same characters night after night until her throat burned and her body trembled from fatigue. In the shadows of her dressing room, with makeup smudged and sweat stinging her eyes, she sometimes stared into the mirror and whispered, "Can I really keep this up?" The spotlight dazzled, but it scorched as much as it illuminated. And just as exhaustion threatened to undo her, the next chapter arrived. The world's answer came in 1985, when Steven Spielberg cast her as Sally in The Color Purple, the bruised but unbreakable heroine of Alice Walker's Pulitzer-winning novel. Whoopi carried every wound of her own life into that role, and it showed. Her performance was not acting, it was survival carved into film. The movie earned 11 Academy Award nominations, and Whoopi herself received a nomination for Best Actress. The girl once mocked as stupid was suddenly standing among Hollywood's greatest. Yet even then, the old doubts refused to die. Could a poor, uneducated black woman truly belong? The pressure consumed her nights, endless interviews, rehearsals, red carpets. Applause thundered in public. But in private, she collapsed into silence, the weight of proving herself heavier than the golden statue she never took home. Years later, she admitted, "That role broke me open, but it also nearly broke me down." The doubts might have lingered, but destiny pressed forward. In 1990, she turned laughter into legend as Oda Mae Brown in Ghost, fusing comedy with raw humanity. A performance so alive it crossed boundaries of race, genre, and expectation. The world laughed with her, cried with her, and erupted when she stepped onto the Academy Award stage to claim the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. Only the second black woman in history to win such a prize. Whoopi shattered yet another barrier, but even that night, after the cameras dimmed and the gown was folded away, she returned to an empty hotel room. The Oscar gleamed, but the silence screamed louder than the ovation. Triumph can be intoxicating, but it can also be unbearably lonely. And still, she pushed on. In 1992, Sister Act catapulted her into international superstardom. As Dolores Van Cartier, the lounge singer hiding among nuns, she turned gospel into gold, comedy into culture. The film grossed over $200 million, spawned a beloved sequel, and etched her name into global pop culture forever. Children sang her songs, families filled theaters. Entire communities embraced her as a beacon of joy. But joy on screen demanded sacrifice off screen. The production schedule was relentless, the press tour unending. She smiled for cameras even as exhaustion hollowed her eyes. In private, she confessed that the pressure to always be Whoopi the star left little space for Corinne, the girl she once was. "People think it's all laughter," she later said. "But sometimes it's just fatigue dressed up as a smile." And then in 1994, she shattered another ceiling, becoming the first black woman to host the Academy Awards solo. standing center stage at the very heart of Hollywood under the weight of a million watching eyes. It was bold, historic, unforgettable, yet the honor came with fire. Every joke, every pause, every gesture was dissected by critics eager to pounce. She bore not just her own reputation, but the burden of representing every woman of color who might follow. The night ended in triumph, but her nerves were raw, her spirit tested. The years that followed proved she was no fleeting star but an enduring force. From tender roles in Karina and The Little Rascals to reshaping television as executive producer of Hollywood Squares from 1998 to 2004, Whoopi's artistry showed no limits, but versatility came at a cost. Long days, endless flights, and the constant fear of being discarded in an industry quick to sideline women past their prime. In 2007, she joined The View, anchoring it for nearly 2 decades, while in 2010 she gave one of her most haunting performances in For Colored Girls and lent her voice to Toy Story 3, touching millions worldwide. Yet even then she admitted with weary honesty, "I don't get to stop." As these decades were carved not just in applause but in exhaustion, not just in fame but in solitude, with every triumph bearing the marks of sacrifice and every ovation echoing with silence when the curtains closed, and yet through it all Whoopi Goldberg rose. From Broadway to box office, from Oscar stages to daytime television, proving that greatness is never a gift but a battle fought in blood, sweat and tears crowned only in light. There comes a moment in every long career when applause shifts into something sharper, when the sound that follows is no longer celebration but judgment. And for Whoopi Goldberg, that moment did not arrive on a movie set or a Broadway stage but beneath the unyielding lights of live television, when in September 2007 she took her seat at The View as moderator. Her voice meant to anchor the table, sharp, witty, unfiltered, unapologetically her own. But with that chair came a new kind of stage, one without a script where every pause, every inflection, every unscripted remark could spark headlines. If her early life had been defined by ovations, this era would be defined by echoes, some supportive, many critical, and none that could be ignored, as her candor. Once her crown became a double-edged risk. In her very first week, she commented on the Michael Vick case, framing her remarks around cultural context, and the response was immediate, with headlines appearing before her words had cooled, commentators dissecting every phrase, and online debates erupting. In 2009, when Roman Polanski was arrested, she discussed aspects of the case in a way that drew strong public reactions, and within hours the clip replayed widely, her comments becoming a focal point of debate. Her defense of Mel Gibson, grounded in her personal experiences with him, also stirred controversy at a time when much of Hollywood had stepped away. And in 2015, her early skepticism regarding the accusations against Bill Cosby shifted into an on-air acknowledgement as she clarified her views in light of the public record and growing discussion, with each storm following the same cruel rhythm, words spoken in seconds, dissected for months as in the studio tension was thick, with the sharp intake of breath from colleagues, the stunned silence of the audience, and the invisible weight that settled on the table, while outside the public fractured, longtime fans who once adored her as Sister Mary Clarence wrestling with disappointment yet unable to look away, some hailing her as fearless, willing to voice what others dared not, others condemning her and branding her bluntness as insensitivity, so that the very voice that had lifted her from New York housing projects to Hollywood's highest stages now hung heavy, an anchor around her neck, a spotlight that no longer warmed but seared. "I'm not perfect," she admitted once, her voice weary but unbroken, and in that moment, millions did not see a polished legend but a woman stripped bare, grappling with the consequences of her own words. As when the cameras switched off, the silence was suffocating, the applause gone, the outrage still roaring, and Whoopi sat alone in her dressing room, the walls closing in, staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering if her truth had crossed into harm, if her candor had become her curse since live television offered no edits, no erasers, every syllable living forever, carved into sound bites and replayed without mercy, and yet she kept returning to that table day after day, year after year, as if Broadway had once demanded stamina. The View demanded something more brutal, the courage to keep speaking even when silence might have saved her. Her persistence, bruised, scarred, but unbowed, its own quiet rebellion, with the scars of these storms not invisible but revealing painfully that words can heal or they can wound, that they can build bridges or burn them to ash, showing that accountability is not fixed ground, but shifting earth ready to swallow the careless. And for Whoopi, they became a crucible, forcing her to reckon with the burden of being not just a performer but a cultural voice, a reminder that visibility is both privilege and peril. While for audiences too there were lessons, as her controversies reminded us that icons stumble, that heroes falter, that greatness does not mean flawlessness, that conversation, raw, imperfect, sometimes excruciating, is how societies move forward, that to listen is as vital as to speak, and perhaps most of all that words are never neutral, that they are like knives, sharp enough to inspire change but also sharp enough to cut deep when wielded without care, that a single phrase can become a scar, a bridge or a beacon. And that is the peril and the promise of language, which is why despite the storms millions still tune in, some coming for her humor, others for her bluntness, but many to witness endurance itself, to see a woman battered by fire yet still refusing silence, for her critics a lightning rod, for her admirers a truth-teller, but for all of us a mirror reflecting both the danger and the power of speech. In the end, Whoopi Goldberg's later career is not defined by the storms that sought to drown her, but by her decision to keep standing in the rain. From ovations that once shook Broadway to the merciless scrutiny of daytime television, carrying light in one hand and shadow in the other, and perhaps that more than any trophy is her enduring legacy. Not perfection but persistence, not comfort but courage, not silence but the willingness to speak, even knowing that words like knives can wound as easily as they can heal. Her story etched not in statues or accolades, but in the scars of her mistakes and the strength of her resilience, a testament to the eternal truth that language is fragile, dangerous, powerful, and in the right hands strong enough to hurt, to heal, and to reshape the world. There is always a moment after the ovations fade and the trophies gather dust when life insists on reminding us that glory and pain walk side by side. And for Whoopi Goldberg, the rising applause of Hollywood could never drown out the echoes of her private scars. Even as the lights of fame began to warm her face, the shadows of her first marriage loomed, a story not of red carpets but of broken glass, whispered arguments, and silent tears. In 1973, barely 18 and still trembling from the wreckage of addiction, she reached for something steady. Alvin Martin, a man who had once guided her through recovery, became that anchor, and in her vulnerability that anchor felt like salvation, someone who saw her not as a failure but as a soul worth saving. Yet what began as reliance soon blurred into something heavier. As she would later reflect, "I didn't know who I was back then. I just knew I needed someone to hold me up." And that same year she gave birth to her only daughter, Alexandrea Alex Martin, with marriage not feeling like a choice but like inevitability, a script written by circumstance rather than love. As a child was coming, and with her the crushing weight of responsibility that Whoopi was barely strong enough to carry. But the union, instead of a refuge, quickly becoming another battlefield. Whoopi, still a teenager, pulled between survival and responsibility, her spirit unready for the role of wife and mother forced upon her. Alvin, though present in title, unable to provide the stability she so desperately craved, their bond carrying an imbalance with authority and dependence, tangled into knots too tight to untangle, bills piling up like unspoken accusations, nights dissolving into exhaustion, and their home growing colder not just from poverty but from silence. Two people bound more by need than by love, until by 1979 the final thread snapped, the marriage over, the court papers stamping one sterile word, divorced, but the truth far more brutal. She only 23, standing at the threshold of adulthood with a baby in her arms and no partner at her side, no applause, no spotlight, just the quiet ache of a young mother staring into a future she had never been prepared for. Years later she would recall the torment of those days. "I was scared every single night. Scared I couldn't feed her. Scared I couldn't protect her. Scared I wasn't enough." As it was a season of despair but also of awakening. For in that hollow quiet, Whoopi learned the most harrowing truth of all. That applause cannot raise a child. That survival demands more than talent. It demands grit, sacrifice, and the courage to keep moving even when the world feels merciless. Those years were suffocating. A blur of hunger, exhaustion, and quiet tears swallowed in the dark. Whoopi, mother and father, provider and protector, even as she herself was still trying to grow up. Their apartment sometimes echoing with laughter, but the brittle laughter of survival. A fragile mask stretched over emptiness, food running thin, clothes fraying until seams gave way, and bills looming like specters on the table. Alex later remembering with stark honesty, "We were poor, Poor to the point where I didn't even know we were poor because it was just normal, while for Whoopi every night was a negotiation between despair and determination, as she would sit by the dim light staring at her sleeping child, whispering promises into the silence, vows she wasn't sure she could keep, that Alex would never feel as unwanted, as unprotected as she herself once had. Years later, Whoopi would confess in an interview, "I didn't always know how we'd make it to the next day, but I knew I couldn't let her feel alone the way I did." But fate has a cruel way of echoing old wounds. As in 1989, history returned like a shadow that refused to lift when Alex, only 16, faced an unplanned pregnancy, and Whoopi, then 34 and just beginning to taste the sweetness of Hollywood success, was suddenly thrust into another role, one of the youngest grandmothers in the industry. While on red carpets, she wore gowns and jewels, cameras flashing like fireworks, her name glowing in lights. But behind the glare, she was reliving her own trauma, watching her daughter stumble into the same storm she had once fought to escape, the irony razor sharp as the world celebrated her ascent to stardom. Yet at home she was battling the generational curse she had sworn to end. In quiet moments, she admitted to friends, "I wanted to protect her from my mistakes." And yet here we were, living them again. This realization cutting deeper than any review or headline, the recognition that unhealed pain can echo across generations, but also lighting the fire that hardened her resolve as she worked longer hours, pushed herself further, sacrificed more fiercely, determined that Alex and her child would never endure the same isolation she had known. Transforming into more than a mother, she became a fortress. More than a grandmother, she became a shield. And from this crucible, her voice grew louder, not only on stages and screens, but in the arena of advocacy as she spoke about women's rights, about education, about the desperate need for support systems so that no young girl would ever feel so cornered, so hopeless, so alone, her private scars becoming a public call to arms, her pain reshaped into a platform, her first marriage remaining the most haunting chapter of her life, not because of its years, but because of the scars it carved into her, thrusting her into battles no teenager should be forced to fight, leaving her wounded, yes, but also forging her into steel, teaching her with brutal clarity that applause cannot raise a child, and that success is hollow if those you love are left hungry, yet also revealing her most enduring gift, the ability to turn suffering into survival, survival into purpose, and purpose into a legacy that stretched beyond herself, so that for Whoopi Goldberg, Alvin Martin is not just a name, etched in the past, but the emblem of the crucible that tested her spirit. Out of the ashes of that broken union rising the resilience of a woman who would one day stand in the brightest spotlight unshaken, and though the ovations of her career often drowned out the echoes of that early pain, it was the scars of her first marriage, the nights of hunger, the silence of loneliness pressing on her chest, the relentless weight of being both mother and father that rooted her resilience the deepest and gave her compassion its fiercest flame. There are chapters in life when the cheers outside rise like thunder, yet the silence at home feels louder still, and by the mid-1980s, Whoopi Goldberg was no longer just an actress clawing for survival, but a star. The color purple having carried her from obscurity to Oscar nominations, her face suddenly recognized across America. 30 years old, walking carpets lit by flashbulbs, shaking hands with the powerful, her name etched into headlines, but beneath the sequins and applause lingering an ache, the longing for something ordinary, grounding, a love steady enough to catch her when the curtain fell, and in 1986, 13 years after her first marriage had collapsed, she believed she had found it in David Claassen, a Dutch cinematographer with an artist's eye and a quiet grace that seemed to balance her storm. And at first it felt like destiny, her fire his calm, her voice filling theaters, his lens capturing light as they married quickly, wrapped in the intoxication of possibility, holding hands on red carpets, smiling as though the flashes themselves had blessed their union. And for a fleeting moment, Whoopi allowed herself to believe she had stepped into the sanctuary she had long craved. But Hollywood is merciless, and as her career soared higher, her schedule consumed entire seasons while Claassen's quieter rhythm fell out of sync with her whirlwind pace. Dinner tables growing colder, phone calls going unanswered, and silences stretching until they became walls until by 1988, barely 2 years later, the dream dissolved. With no children, no scandal, just the slow, suffocating realization that love alone could not withstand the machinery of ambition. To the tabloids a footnote, to Whoopi another scar, As alone in hotel rooms with trophies on the dresser, she admitted to herself that success often felt lonelier than poverty ever had. 6 years passed, and by 1994, Whoopi was 38 at the peak of cultural power, having hosted the Academy Awards, fronted box office juggernauts like Sister Act, and carved her place as one of Hollywood's most unshakable icons. Yet even then, fame could not silence the quiet ache, and that year she tried again, this time with Lyle Trachtenberg, an actor and union organizer, not a blind leap of youth but the cautious step of a woman who thought marriage might be what life or society expected of her, the wedding glimmering like a match struck in the dark, bright, hopeful but brief as within a year the flame died. With no children, no epic battles, just another unraveling, another night of quiet self-reckoning, and Whoopi later admitting with her trademark candor, "I never really wanted to be married. People think I did it for love, but truth is I did it because I thought that's what you were supposed to do." Which was not regret but clarity, as unlike her first marriage born from desperation and survival, these later ones were experiments, attempts to wear the mask of wife in a world that demanded it. But Whoopi's spirit was never built for molds, too restless, too blunt, too fiercely independent to live within vows that rang hollow, so that by the end of the 1990s she had been married 3 times, which on paper looked like failure, to gossip columns was scandal, but to her was revelation, as each vow broken had carved a truth that love cannot be forced, that stability cannot be faked, that peace cannot be found by living someone else's script, teaching her that sometimes the bravest act is not staying but leaving before the illusion devours you whole. Her scars becoming wisdom, and as she said once with a wry smile sharpened by years of disappointment, "The only thing I'm married to now is my freedom," or which perhaps is her greatest legacy, not the fairy tales society demands but the courage to live unbound. Since these marriages were not the glossy romances of Hollywood but brief, flawed, profoundly human, and in their breaking they gave her something indestructible, the freedom to choose herself again and again, even when the world expected otherwise. There are love stories born in whispers, sheltered and unseen, and then there are those dragged beneath floodlights where tenderness and flaws are magnified, until the weight becomes unbearable. And for Whoopi Goldberg, the most controversial chapter of her romantic life came not in quiet corners but under the relentless glare of cameras, when her heart became entwined with Ted Danson, America's beloved sitcom star. Whoopi was already a household name by the early 1990s, having won an Oscar, dominated the box office, and had an unmistakable voice. With his charisma ingrained in American television, Ted was also at the height of his fame. For a brief moment, they appeared to be the script of fate, 2 stars circling one another, their laughter unguarded, their presence together radiant. This must have felt like rare sunshine after years of storms to Whoopi, who had experienced hunger, loneliness, and the heavy silence of single motherhood. It was a love that was finally chosen rather than forced upon her by survival. But fragility lurked beneath the warmth. Ted's relationship with Whoopi only served to increase the scrutiny of his failing, but still intact marriage to Casey Coates. Entering into such a relationship was a risky decision for Whoopi, one that might have promised intimacy, but had repercussions that neither love nor celebrity could protect her from. Every smile was analyzed, every touch was exaggerated into scandal, and what could have been private tenderness was dragged into the news. Their love was judged in front-page fonts rather than whispers, turning it from a haven into a spectacle. At the Friars Club roast in Whoopi's honor in 1993, the storm reached a breaking point. The celebration, shrouded in comedy's license to shock, was supposed to be irreverent. Rather, it took a disastrous turn. Ted's act, which was meant to be humorous but was interpreted as offensive, relied heavily on caricature and provocative imagery. What started out as jest turned into condemnation as the audience's laughter broke apart, with some feeling uneasy and others horrified. Hotter spotlights blazed in outrage rather than celebration. It was a double blow for Whoopi. She was at the center of the evening, both as a shield and as an honoree, having helped to shape it and even contribute some of the material. Her private relationship had suddenly become inextricably linked to a public controversy. She was tied to Ted, the act, and the commotion by the headlines, which did more than just name him. She was unable to pass a newsstand for weeks without seeing their faces and hearing scandalous remarks. The price was even higher behind closed doors. She was afflicted not only by the siege of love, but also by the judgment of her own heart in the most severe court: public opinion. Later, in more private moments, she would confess, "It felt like the world was watching my heart break. What had once been intimacy became exposure, and what had once been warmth became weight." The romance ended by the middle of the 1990s, a scar etched into memory, a reminder that intimacy lived under the spotlight is never truly intimate, without a wedding, vows, or children. For Whoopi, it served as yet another lesson in the harsh math of celebrity. Love is so brittle when it is lived in front of millions of people that it can break before it can take root. But something survived that fracture. The controversy compelled society to face difficult issues regarding humor, accountability, and the potency of imagery. It became clear that performances and words are never neutral. They always carry histories and wounds that go much beyond intentionality. It turned into yet another trial for Whoopi, teaching her that as a cultural icon, she had to live with the consequences of her decisions, as well as the impact they had on other people. She has never attempted to rewrite that chapter as either tragic or triumphant. She allowed it to remain in its unadulterated human form, delicate at first, imperfect as it developed, and expensive in the end. And maybe its greatest legacy is that honesty. It was more than just a scandal or a fairy tale. It was a mirror reflecting the harshness of celebrity and the frailty of love. The lesson for viewers is subtle but timeless. Even celebrities make mistakes. Vulnerable decisions can have unintended consequences, and love itself, no matter how genuine, is always subject to the influence of context. Resilience, the understanding that her strength lay not in avoiding storms but in surviving them, even when the rain fell most heavily on her own heart, was what Whoopi had left behind instead of bitterness. We are reminded daily that the heart is never invincible by losses that do not go away with time, wounds that do not heal, and wounds that stay raw and open. After decades of victories, scandals, and survival, Whoopi Goldberg suffered the most devastating blows from fate's ruthless hand when it took away from her the two people who had supported her the most throughout her life: her mother, Emma, and her only brother, Clyde. These blows came not from detractors or broken promises. Even though Whoopi had everything the world could offer in 2010 at the age of 54, Oscars, Emmys, standing ovations, and her face recognized across continents, no amount of power could protect her when the phone rang and everyone fell silent. Emma Johnson, her mother, was no longer with her. Emma had been more than just a mom. In the Chelsea Elliott projects, she had been a nurse, teacher, warrior, protector, and the one who had provided for her children when she herself had nothing left. Losing her meant losing the center of her existence, not just her family. Later, Whoopi whispered, "She was my everything," words that convey more sorrow than justification. The funeral was a haze of black coats and flowers, but the true mourning started in the kitchen chair that would never be filled again, in the phone number she could no longer dial, and in the instinct to call her mother but knowing that no one was there to answer. Even though Whoopi had performed in front of millions of people, she had never felt so alone or so completely orphaned as she did on those nights when she sat by herself with silence pressed against her chest. Then fate cut again, as though grief hadn't already hollowed her out. Clyde, Emma's only sibling and the last surviving member of their childhood, died in 2015, 5 years after Emma's death. Clyde was just her brother, the one who had called her Karen, the one who had shared her laughter through hunger and adversity, and the only one who remembered the girl she had been before the world renamed her Whoopi. He was neither a fellow celebrity nor a prominent figure in public life. "He was my first best friend and my partner in crime," she thought, her voice cracking under the strain of recollection. It seemed like her whole childhood had been buried with him when he passed away. The double defeat was intolerable. Behind the curtain, she carried two absences like shadows sewn to her, but on stage she still wore the armor of humor, delivering sharp wit and unapologetic candor. It could not be erased by success, camouflaged by cameras, or touched by applause. There was always a pause at home between each laugh she shared with the world. A pause where her brother's laughter once responded, and her mother's voice once comforted her. Despite this depressing loss, Whoopi made the compassionate decision rather than give up. She talked more about family and how important it is to keep loved ones close. In remembrance of Emma's sacrifices, she spoke out in favor of causes that assisted single mothers. In remembrance of her mother's nursing career, she supported healthcare advocacy. Knowing all too well the shape of their emptiness, she stood by communities in mourning. Her personal tragedy gave rise to a public mission, to serve as a reminder to others that love is short-lived and that the only things worth preserving are the relationships we form while we can. Her story strikes a chord with the universal pain for anyone who has buried a parent or bid farewell to a sibling. It teaches us that grieving is a sign of love, not weakness, that grief is a bridge to all other broken hearts, not a private prison. Ultimately, the decade that claimed Whoopi Goldberg's mother and brother left her with more than just grief. It also left her with a truth that she now bears with her like a torch, that while accolades fade and awards collect dust, love, when lost, leaves an enduring mark. The reminder to live, love, and hold fiercely before the silence arrives is contained in that marking, which also contains the wound and the gift. Inside the body, there are wounds that bleed silently, battles that are unseen but more brutal than any storm in public. Following the burial of her brother in 2015 and her mother in 2010, Whoopi Goldberg entered her 60s with a sense of isolation that no standing ovation could alleviate. She believed that fate had already taken what it could and that she had survived the worst. Then, however, it inwardly directed its cruelty. Her own frail breath was the enemy this time, not scandal or heartache. She had lived with endometriosis, a disease that causes a woman's body to twist into silent agony. Long before hospitals and news headlines, she suffered for years with no definitive answers, navigating a medical system that was too slow to pay attention. She later broke the silence with her characteristic candor, not out of sympathy but out of truth. She acknowledged, "Too many of us are left to think the pain is just part of life." Both rage and defiance were evident in her voice, rage at the frequent disregard for women's suffering and defiance at transforming her personal suffering into public advocacy. However, she was unprepared for 2018 and 2019. What started out as exhaustion and a persistent cough, symptoms that are easily dismissed, grew into a disaster. Her blood became infected as the pneumonia spread through her lungs. "No one forgets," doctors said. 30% is your chance. Like a verdict, the number kept repeating in her head. Awards couldn't tip the scales. Fame didn't matter here. She sensed the shadow of death, the same shadow that had already taken her mother and brother, looming close in that sterile room with beeping machines and tubes removing fluid from her chest. Would she be the next to go? As she carried their memory, would her daughter and grandchildren do the same for her? After she returned, she admitted, "I was on the verge of leaving here." Simple words, but behind them lay nights of terror so intense that time itself felt as though it were holding its breath. She disappeared from the view for 6 weeks, leaving her chair empty and her laughter gone. Colleagues prayed, fans wondered. She negotiated with herself alone, one more sunrise, one more opportunity. Furthermore, the standing ovation was unheard of when she eventually returned to the set. Slower, thinner, but still alive. It was for survival itself, not for humor or acting. She was altered by illness. Even her sharpest edges were softened by the gratitude that permeated her humor. Every shared laugh turned into a blessing and every morning into a gift. She started talking candidly about fragility, not to dramatize but to remind. There is no guarantee of health. There is a limit to time. The act of breathing is a privilege. Her story struck a chord with anyone who has ever sat at a hospital bedside and felt their body betray them. You are not alone, and survival is victory in and of itself. The body continued to be a battlefield even after recovery. It was a never-ending battle with weight. Whoopi used her platform carefully, but she was also open about seeking medical help, including GLP-1 treatments like Monaro. She vehemently condemned the use of her face in phony advertisements for weight loss products created by artificial intelligence. "I didn't say it. I didn't support it," she cautioned, preserving not only her reputation but also the weak who could be tricked. That warning served as a reminder that the truth itself has the power to save lives and was another act of compassion. Although her near-death experience did not elevate suffering, it did instill in her the value of survival. You cannot escape death by achieving success. Applause won't stop an infection. Resilience, however, can surpass hopelessness if it is chosen breath by breath. Whoopi, who had already experienced the loss of her mother and brother, saw this encounter with death as more than just a personal nightmare. It was a universal mirror that spoke to all patients who have whispered promises into the dark, all daughters who are afraid of leaving their children too soon, and all souls who have prayed for one more day. Therefore, the applause in this chapter was not for a performance or a flawlessly delivered line, but rather for something bigger, The return, the bravery to breathe again, and the determination to stand under the lights to remind us all that life itself, fragile, ephemeral, and miraculous, is the role that should be most treasured. Whoopi Goldberg, now 69, leads a life that few could have predicted for the young child who was called stupid in a New York school. She has gained treasures from her journey, which has taken her from Chelsea Elliott's projects to the highest echelons of Hollywood, including space, silence, and the freedom to live her life as she pleases. Her main residence is a large estate from the 1920s in Llewellyn Park, West Orange, New Jersey, a verdant community that was once the home of American titans like Thomas Edison. Peeling paint and narrow hallways from her childhood contrast sharply with the mansion's ivy-clad walls, polished wood interiors, and peaceful gardens. She has created a haven inside those gates, complete with a library full of history and script books, a kitchen that smells of the comfort food she used to crave, and expansive verandas where she can spend her evenings thinking, without being distracted by the bustle of the outside world. She maintains a second home in Sardinia, Italy, far from the paparazzi. It's a bright villa overlooking the sea, where the Mediterranean horizon appears to go on forever and salt winds rattle the shutters. She can spend days there staring at the waves crashing against the cliffs, writing in notebooks or listening to audiobooks. After decades of unrelenting work, she finds her energy again in this place of renewal. She once remarked, "Sometimes you just need quiet to hear yourself again." Whoopi has never been characterized by excess, in contrast to many Hollywood celebrities. Her estimated $30 million net worth, which she has accumulated over 4 decades as an actor, comedian, producer, and host, is modest in comparison to moguls but stable. She is not a fan of gilded palaces or fleets of fancy cars. Her wealth reflects her independence rather than her appetite. It is pragmatic and lived in. Fans are reminded that she has always presented herself as approachable, human, and grounded despite her fame by the fact that she frequently drives standard sedans or SUVs. Her family life continues to be central to her identity. Once the child she brought up in poverty, her daughter Alexandria, Alex Martin, has gone on to become an actress and producer. Through Alex, Whoopi became a grandmother in her 30s and eventually a great-grandmother, roles she has accepted with humility and humor. She has made jokes about having a large family and being an old broad, but beneath the jokes lies a pride no trophy could match. In New Jersey, family get-togethers frequently involve several generations, serving as a living reminder that survival has evolved into legacy. She has chosen independence out of love. Whoopi, who has been open about her preference for solitude after 3 marriages and highly publicized relationships, once said, "I don't want somebody in my house." Rather than pursuing romantic relationships, she has put her heart into friendships, her daughter and grandchildren, and the causes she supports. Today she combines reach and simplicity in her life. In addition to getting ready for the eagerly anticipated Sister Act 3, she still makes daily appearances on The View, with her voice as piercing and unrepentant as ever. With the same fervor she once brought to the stage, she now advocates for social causes, including LGBTQ+ rights, women's healthcare, cannabis advocacy, and the 2025 launch of AWSN, a women's sports network on Pluto TV. Her endeavors are not characterized by indulgence, but rather by purpose, a means of directing her influence into areas where voices are frequently silenced. Nevertheless, her life is still tinged with absence beneath all the homes and headlines, the cheers and the activism. The deaths of her brother Clyde in 2015 and mother Emma in 2010 continued to reverberate in the quiet times. An empty seat at the dinner table, a silence she occasionally tries to fill with laughter but is unable to do so. She acknowledged that every morning feels like a second chance after almost passing away from pneumonia in 2019. Her fortune is now measured in mornings spent on a New Jersey porch, afternoons by the Mediterranean Sea, dinners with her grandchildren's chatter echoing through the halls, and the freedom to choose peace after decades of chaos. She said, "Breath is a gift, and she doesn't take it for granted." Her life is proof that survival is not just about escaping poverty or outlasting illness. It is about arriving at a place where you can finally sit still, look back, and know that every scar was the price of building something enduring. At the age of 69, Whoopi Goldberg's wealth is evident in the lives she has impacted rather than in her estate or financial gains. She has donated millions to charitable causes over the years, including those that support LGBTQ+ advocacy, education, HIV/AIDS awareness, women's health, and community projects. She co-founded the wellness business Whoopi and Maya in 2016 to assist women in managing chronic pain. In 2021, she rebranded it as Emma and Clyde, a loving homage to her late mother and brother, turning loss into public service. She amplified voices that had been marginalized for too long by launching AWSN, a women's sports network on Pluto TV, in 2025. Her signature trait, converting experiences into empathy and wounds into service, has been present in every project, whether it has been charitable or commercial. However, absence has never been quieted by comfort. Silence reigns even in her opulent estate in New Jersey from the 1920s, with its expansive lawns and book and trophy shelves. The faces of Emma and Clyde will never return to those halls. Additionally, illness has left its mark. Endometriosis when she was younger, pneumonia that almost killed her in 2018, and the constant reminders of aging that no celebrity can cover up. In quieter moments, she acknowledges that every breath is a gift. It is not a line for applause. Rather, it is the reality of a woman who has stood too close to the edge and she still laughs about it on air. These later years are characterized by paradox rather than perfection. Whoopi is iconic yet painfully human, brave yet exhausted, fearless yet vulnerable. She continues to appear on The View every day. Her candor is sharp as ever, but she bears scars, regrets about failed marriages, the hurt of hastily spoken words, and loneliness that cannot be healed by praise alone. She continues to build and create, including the eagerly anticipated Sister Act 3, but she is perhaps more aware than ever that the stage cannot accommodate every vacant seat. Her legacy is complex, untidy, and authentic. She is the young mother raising a daughter alone in poverty, the teen who battled addiction, the actress who broke down barriers in Hollywood, the activist who marched for justice, the survivor who has experienced death itself, and the child who was once called stupid due to dyslexia. She has made mistakes, uttered words she later regretted, stumbled and been flawed, human and flawed, and perhaps that is her greatest lesson. Mistakes do not erase meaning, and scars can become maps for others if they are carried honestly. Her later life is a tale of truth if her early years were one of survival, and her middle years were one of victory and upheaval. The fact that grief cannot be erased by wealth. The fact that love cannot be guaranteed by fame. Truth. Being strong means getting back up after failing, even in front of others. Perhaps that is what Whoopi Goldberg leaves behind. Not just her movies, her awards, or even her iconic roles, but the reminder that greatness is forged not by perfection, but by perseverance, kindness, and the guts to live life as it is. Therefore, her legacy has already touched you if you have ever laughed at one of her performances, paused at one of her words, or felt less alone after hearing one of her stories. Because Whoopi Goldberg's story is not one of perfect victories, but rather of an honest life filled with setbacks and victories, joy and sorrow, fortitude and uncertainty. Not as an untouchable legend, but as a reflection of what it means to be human, she has stumbled, failed, and risen. Her experience serves as a reminder that strength is the light that shines through cracks rather than the lack of them. Perhaps the more important lesson in a society that strives for polish and perfection is found in imperfection itself, that honesty, even when it is painful and expensive, has a strength that goes beyond praise. We would love to know if her journey has ever made you think, laugh, or feel less alone. Which of her characters, the color purple, Sister Act, or Ghost, does she most remind you of? If you would like to continue walking with us through stories like these, stories that subtly but firmly remind us that being human has always been enough, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts.